How to Become a Virgin by Quentin Crisp. Published 1981. The Beginning. I am not a dropout. I was never in. I have not spent my life hacking my way through the constraints of a bourgeois existence. I was always free, appallingly free. For my first 50 years, I was like someone standing alone in a landscape which led to infinite possibilities in all directions, but in which there was an arena surrounded by an insurmountable wall. Over this floated shouts and cheers provoked by an Olympiad, from which I keenly felt my exclusion, both as spectator and player. In England, this perpetual tournament has no name. Americans call it the big time. These games are incapable of sharper definition than this, because their rules are rearranged by each person who goes on to the field, and the rewards of victory are not entirely measurable, not wholly of this world. If you beat your head against this high wall, or indeed against any wall, after a while it will crumble, but such a course of action requires at least a positive temperament. This, if I ever had it, I lost in childhood, at a time when my two brothers aspired to be splendid icons of manliness, such as firemen or ship's captains. All I wanted to be was a chronic invalid. For this vocation I had a certain flair. Unfortunately, my parents decided that, as a career, it would prove too expensive. Now I could obtain a grant, but then I was forced to strike out of my heart all hope of becoming a kinky Mrs. Browning. Even so, nothing that has happened to me since that unhappy time has been the result of healthy, vigorous action on my part. I have always proceeded cautiously. However, even if you only lean limply against a wall, and you happen to live a very long time, gradually it will begin to give way. In my case, this process took more than half a century. My journey from the outer suburbs, almost to the heart of the city of happiness, came about only partly as a result of my own feeble persistence. It was chiefly caused by a fragile chain of lucky events and by the inexplicable kindness of a series of people who knew me only slightly and one another not at all. This entire volume is an extension of that list of acknowledgments that in other books occupies but a single paragraph, chapter 1. By the time this century had reached its middle 60s, and I had attained my middle 50s, the wages of art school models had risen so steeply that the difficulty they presented was no longer how to live on them, it had become how to deserve them. In trying to solve this problem, the students were little help. Nothing could persuade them to suggest some difficult, dangerous pose that might rouse them from their permanent lethargy. To them, life drawing was merely an arduous chore in which there was no money. They clearly wished I was not there. One day, when I was working in Lawton College of Further Education, the life master was able to prevent only one of his pupils from escaping. "Well," he exclaimed, turning towards her and beaming broadly, "the entire day, the whole room, and all of Mr. Crisp are yours." Folding her arms across her sullen breasts, the girl replied with a weary question, "Why is it always up to me?" In some ways, the decline in popularity of life drawing was a secret blessing. My physical stamina was declining so drastically that, even if enthusiasm for my efforts had been evinced, I could no longer have sustained wildly heroic poses all day and every day. To conceal this fact, I took to posing intermittently. In the end, this would have made my declining years extremely impecunious, but for a while I preferred this way of life. It allowed me more spare time, which I put to good use by indulging in my only hobby, doing nothing. For this innocent pastime I have always been severely criticized. When I was a child, my mother and sister used to sit each side of a threadbare fire, busily sewing or writing letters. I lay motionless on the hearthrug between them. At least once an hour one of them, with an irritable sigh, would ask, "Why don't you get something to do?" I always replied, "Why should I?" Later in life, when strangers asked me what I did with my spare time and I told them I did nothing, they too became instantly agitated. To them even the most fatuous alternatives to idleness seemed preferable. "But you don't really do nothing, do you?" "Yes." "But you read." "Books are for writing, not for reading." "Well, then you write." "Not if I can possibly get out of it." "Don't you listen to the radio?" "Listening to the radio is like holding a conversation with someone who is wearing dark glasses." "Then you watch television?" "Seldom, and never to kill time." "But you can't just do nothing." With my back to the wall, I concede that I breathe and I blink. At this point, my inquisitor's fury usually explodes over me like a hand grenade. I can't deny that, secretly, my pathological indolence had begun to cause even me a little anxiety. I was faced with a problem which will continue to confront all elderly people until such time as the government undertakes to decide when its senior citizens shall die. The night was coming, and I increasingly felt the need for a tin box full of coins lurking under the bed. But at the same time, my earning capacity was on the wane. Not only my physical strength, but my resourcefulness and my optimism were gone. By now, it was years since I had applied anywhere for a specific job, and decades since I had written anything and sent it unsolicited to an editor. My efforts to deal with my predicament were generalized. I leaned permanently forward, so that fate could see me, and I tried never to say no to anything. My chief weakness was my lifelong lack of specific ambition. If a man demands a lot from fate, he will probably receive something. If he wants but little, he will almost certainly get nothing. In the long run, in spite of everything, I have been very lucky. I asked for bread and was given a stone. It turned out to be precious. Chapter 2. One afternoon, wrapped in a filthy dressing gown and seated by my asthmatic gas fire, I was staring aimlessly at my feet, which were sitting in the chair opposite me, when the front doorbell rang. No one was expected, but I took this sign from the outer world calmly. By this time I had lived in the same room so long that I knew perhaps 150 people, any of whom might call on me without warning. On this occasion my visitor was Mr. O'Connor. This I did find mildly surprising, because I had not seen him for about 15 years. In the happy far-off times when I knew him best, Philip O'Connor was a full-time hooligan. He sat all day in layabout cafes, and stood half the night in the public houses of Fitzrovia, spouting improvised doggerel to friends and strangers alike, without hoping or even wishing to be understood. That stage of his development was evidently past. Looking back on this incident, I think he must by now have written The Memoirs of a Public Baby, and that the instant fame that this book had brought him had introduced him to the BBC's third program. He now worked for it. This had changed him. He looked the same as before. Disraeli ringlets still hung over a brow not merely pallid, but incandescent with moral decay. His eyes were still as bright as those of a sex maniac, and his smile as mirthless as the hilarity of a skull. It was his personality that was different. He now wanted to get things done, an ambition absolutely forbidden in the southern confines of Bohemia, which he used to frequent. After feverishly walking up and down my room for a while, he suddenly asked if he might bring in his tape recorder. When I gave permission, he rushed downstairs, returning a minute later with a contraption as big as a gas meter. It must have been in his car, another sign of redemption from hooliganism. As soon as he was sure that the black magic box was working, he thrust a microphone towards my astonished lips and said, "Say something about life and death!" If I am ever told that this method of conducting an interview succeeds with other people, I shall be amazed. It suited me perfectly. Compensating for the breadth of the subject by the shallowness of my views, I spoke, and I spoke, and I spoke. Only when the machine seemed out of breath did I stop. Mr. O'Connor appeared satisfied with what had been said, and left almost immediately. I set little store by this episode. In the good old days, Charlotte Street was full of people who were nearly on the stage or were just about to write a play. It seemed at the time so unlikely that anyone who had once been an habitué of that twilight land could ever in fact establish a working relationship with the real world, or even with the BBC. I was wrong. Mr. O'Connor returned to my room a few days later with his boss, and when I had added a few peroratory phrases, my contribution to the program was considered complete. I never heard what I had said to the world, because I do not listen to radio broadcasts. I cannot even say if my words were generally well received, but I know that at least one person listened, because long after the entire incident was closed, I was told that a publisher had said that I ought to write a book. One's acquaintances are forever saying this, even if one only makes one joke a year. The words are intended as a vague compliment rather than a specific encouragement. But if anyone in the book trade makes the remark, it must be taken seriously. Secretly, I was annoyed that I had not been told of this comment sooner. The publisher in question was called William Kimber. I was informed that he published any number of books by disused colonels and the memoirs of a lot of extinct district nurses. We had never met, but I made so bold as to telephone him. He bravely admitted that the words he was rumored to have uttered had indeed fallen from his unguarded lips. Furthermore, he promised that, if I would write a 2,000-word synopsis of my autobiography, he would read it, or possibly cause it to be read. He would then tell me whether or not he could offer me a contract. Even a little of my life proved too much for Mr. Kimber. He wrote me a very courteous letter, praising my frankness, but added that he feared that, if he published a book founded on the incidents I had described, he would be bombarded from all directions with libel suits. I cannot imagine why he thought this. Though I am relentlessly outspoken about myself, I am unlikely to be indiscreet concerning others. Indeed, I seldom mention them. In any case, if I were to say that, on some specific occasion, I had popped into a dark corner with the Duke of Birmingham, a compositor could easily have set the name as B.rm.ngh.m and kept the reader guessing. I had expected Mr. Kimber's reaction, but being accustomed to sorrow is not the same as suffering in silence. Later in my career as a model, I began to find the competition for employment in the London schools too fierce. I took to working in the home counties. There, the college to which I went most frequently was Maidstone. I travelled thither in a railway carriage stuffed to the brim with art masters. To them I told my tale of woe. Nothing shortens a journey so pleasantly as an account of misfortunes at which the hearer is permitted to laugh. One member of my audience was a man who, I am told, now rules Maidstone, but who was then only a hireling. Even so, he wielded considerable power, being married to Thames and Hudson. "Kimber," he exclaimed, when I had come to the end of my story, "I think you can do better than that. I have my spies," he added, "and I will put them out." He must have done so at once. Within a few days I was introduced to my first literary agent, a Catholic Texan, married to a Protestant Irishwoman, living in Putney. He submitted what I had written for Mr. Kimber, together with photographs taken of me some 30 years earlier, to Messrs. Jonathan Cape, and in no time at all I was given a contract and £100. I nearly fainted. By the time the book came out, I had received, I think, about £300. After that, on the English hardback edition, my royalties never amounted to much. I imagine that, when advance payments to authors are being fixed, the publishers' accountants go into a dim corner of the office, their fingers tap their lips rapidly, and their pale lips move as they calculate exactly what the writer's earnings will be on the edition they intend to print. This is the sum offered. I had wanted my autobiography to be called My Reign in Hell. I was convinced that, after turning the first few pages, readers would agree that I had closely followed Mr. Lucifer's example by refusing to serve in heaven, respectable society. This title was rejected, and from a few random ideas, The Naked Civil Servant was chosen. The name was suggested by an incident described toward the end of the book. A feature writer contributing to a paper called The Scotsman came to interview me. During our conversation, or rather my monologue, whilst I was drawing breath, he managed to ask if I was a famous model. I explained that, by that time, there was no such thing. The relationship between artists and their models had ceased to be a cause of prurient speculation, not because newspapers and their readers had become any more clean-minded, but for the simpler reason that painters no longer worked from the nude. Models now work only in the schools. They are engaged by the term, and their wages ultimately come from the Minister of Education. They are just like civil servants, except that during office hours they wear no clothes. This title was a mistake. Almost everywhere I go, audiences ask me to explain it, and if I do not, bewilderment in the minds of book buyers gives place to fatal misunderstanding. A friend told me that, while she was visiting her mother in Lewes, the first object that caught her eye as she entered the chintzy living-room was my book lying on a table. "Whatever made you get that?" my friend gasped. In a calm, slightly supercilious tone her mother replied, "I don't know what you're making such a fuss about. You know I've always been interested in the civil service." Before my autobiography was published, I had written 3 books on various subjects, and one longer work of fiction called Love Made Easy. This had been rejected, rightly, as it later transpired. When, 25 years after it was completed, it was very kindly published by Duckworth, it received bad notices, even in New Zealand. The difference between all these previous efforts to earn a living by writing and my life story was its scandal value. The Young, led to victory by the Beatles, had inherited the earth about 10 years before my book was ready for publication. Their wealth has given teenagers throughout the world the power to set fashions not only in what to wear and how to dance, but also in what to say. Since children always wish to talk about what their parents never mention, sex became a subject of open, nay, incessant discussion. When inevitably, as a theme for table talk, heterosexuality was worn threadbare, it was supplanted by homosexuality, which became all the rage. The fact that the laws concerning it were in the process of being changed gave this particular pastime an added topicality. If to be a man of destiny is to arrive at a point in history when the only gift you have to offer has suddenly become relevant, then in this tiny and purely social way, that is what, for the moment, I became. When my book was as nearly complete as I could make it, my publisher gave me the hand of an editress in literary marriage. She was a beautiful woman whose eyes, whether she was redeeming my ungainly prose or merely shopping in Fulham Road, forever held an expression of dismayed surprise. Naturally, I cannot say if she wore this look before she encountered me. She was infinitely patient, never making the slightest emendation to my typescript without consulting me, always explaining why an alteration would be for the better. If I interpret her correctly, she was advising me to make my sentences short. She was saying that, if they were in the right order, conjunctions would seldom be necessary. Then, on the rare occasion when a connecting word was used, it would be endowed with a special dramatic power of its own. I do not mean that she told me all this at any one meeting. It is what I deduce from the nature of the improvements that she urged me to make. Some years later I told her that I now write by the Miller method. I think she said, "Come off it," which no editress should ever say. If she happens to read this book and finds it to be full of grammatical errors, no doubt her look of dismay will be intensified. In spite of all the care lavished upon my book, it could not be described as a wild success. The reviews of it were at best kind. At worst they were, as I am sure most authors find, contradictory. One said that it was full of self-pity. Someone else remarked that upon its freedom from precisely this emotion. One critic was delighted by the aphorisms which the pages were riddled with. The Times literary supplement deplored the arch and jaunty style in which the story was told. I never reject criticism on the fatuous grounds that it is prompted by unworthy motives, or that to care about it is in some way beneath me. I hold that the very purpose of existence is to reconcile the glowing opinion we hold of ourselves with the appalling things that other people think about us. This book is therefore written in a minimum risk style, with which I hope to offend nobody. I am aware that this does not guarantee that I shall please everybody. Ultimately, I believe that, with a hideous struggle, the hardback edition of The Naked Civil Servant sold out its edition of about 3,500 copies. The failure or success of the book, however, was not the point. What mattered was that another chunk of the wall against which I had for so long been leaning had given way. Through the aperture thus created, I could now see a tantalizing corner of the arena that I longed to enter. About a month after my autobiography was published, I was interviewed on television for the first time. Chapter 3. To celebrate the fact that, in a parochial way, an inhabitant of the Kingdom of Bohemia was beginning to make good, a hooligans' party was given. The idea for this feast was put forward by someone who, during the war, had himself been an habitué of the Charlotte Street cafes, but who was now redeemed, firstly by marriage, and secondly by having become a barrister. The arrangements for this occasion were thrust into the astonished hands of a young woman, who, though known to both of us, had never truly been a hooliganette. It was a thoroughly embarrassing assignment that she had been given, because all the guests had to be asked for money, 10 shillings, I think. She implored me, to provide her with a list of subscribers, but I could think of no one that I would have the nerve to suggest would pay for the mere privilege of eating with me. In spite of my lack of cooperation, she managed by charm and persistence to muster enough diners to enable her to hire what the Bible would call an upper room. It was in Schmidt's restaurant. Though this establishment was in the middle of Charlotte Street, it presented to the world a face so cold and worse so clean that I do not think any of my friends had ever ventured into it before. The party was a lively but rather awkward gathering of people whom I knew intimately, slightly, or not at all. Among them was a man well-dressed and well-behaved beyond the demands of the situation. When he left, the other guests asked one another in awe-struck tones, who was the visitor from the outer world? In fact, he was a televisionary who, on leaving, promised to see what he could do for me. A few weeks later, it was at his command that I was summoned to the dead of night to the BBC studios in Shepherd's Bush. I found myself in the cast of a program called Late Night Lineup, whose other members were a Monk and Fanny Craddock. I took to her immediately because of the degree of animation that she infuses into her public appearances, and indeed into her entire life. After the show was over, and we were all sitting in the drinking room waiting for taxis to take us home, someone approached her and said, "It's over, Fanny, it's finished." She laughed. She had been speaking just as fast and as vigorously as when the cameras were watching her. Eagerness to please, devoid of sycophancy, is a characteristic I greatly admire. While I was waiting to go into the cage with the interviewer, I was questioned 3 times as to whether or not I was nervous. After twice saying no, I asked, "What have I got to lose?" "Quite right," said my interrogator. "Just the right attitude." If I had been afraid, the repeated question would have turned me into a nervous wreck. At this first interview, the words, "What have I got to lose?" were uttered almost in self-defense, but they exactly expressed my attitude towards the occasion. I had only negative goals. I wanted not to start every sentence with "well" or I wished to survive whatever was said to me without displaying embarrassment or shock. I need not have worried. The questions were very bland. Most of them concerned the oddities of my appearance and of my domestic routine. As the years have flown by, the questions have remained much the same. It is the answers that have changed, not in content, but in manner. I no longer regard television interviews as ordeals that must be endured without flinching. They have become welcome opportunities for presenting myself and my ideas to the world, mini-parties, which I enjoy and through which I try to offer entertainment to others. I could almost say that they have become a way of life. Within weeks of the publication of The Naked Civil Servant, I found myself being asked to speak to small gatherings of people. They were of various denominations. Sometimes they were literary aspirants. To these I repeated that books are for writing, not for reading. To be more explicit, I explained that no one who intends to take up writing as a career should read any work that lies in the category in which his own efforts would be placed. If he disobeys this rule, he will almost certainly feel that he must write literature instead of trying to say what he means. Even though he may not attempt patches of deathless prose, he will become preoccupied with grammar and syntax far more complicated than he would ever use when speaking. This is now quite unnecessary. Since the invention of Frank Norman, writing has at last ceased to be a middle-class accomplishment. It has become an activity as universal as sex and almost as exhausting. When not with embryonic authors, I was invited to universities or art schools. There I explained that education is a mistake. Cluttering one's skull with facts about any subject other than oneself I hold to be a waste of time. All general knowledge can be discovered in the nearest public library, and even those hushed and apparently harmless establishments should be visited with caution. Being well informed is but a stone's throw from being boring, and stones will be thrown. In seats of learning, on whatever social level, audiences are often livelier than elsewhere. While I was talking to the inmates of East Ham Polytechnic, one young man abruptly stumbled out of the room. He returned a few minutes later with the explanation that he had found it prudent to stand in the corridor for a while to cool his rage. "You're lucky," he warned me. "I've got a terrible temper, and I nearly clobbered you." What had so incensed him was my statement that artists should disregard social issues. East Ham is a fully committed region. Inevitably, the audiences that I was most often asked to amuse were members of the Campaign for Homosexual Equality, or other kindred organizations. If I spoke to lesbian societies, no men were ever present. Perhaps like a Masonic lodge in reverse, they occasionally held a gentleman's night, but I never attended one. Their policy at that time seemed to be gently isolationist. To give an example, at a mixed gathering at Croydon, a girl said, "I suppose I shouldn't ask you this, but why do the boys keep on at us to come into their meetings? I can't see any point." I gave a non-committal reply to conceal my surprise at this question. Traditionally, in the heterosexual world, it is the men who will not attend any social occasion unless it holds carnal possibilities. That is what makes them so hard to get along with. I was sorry to be made aware that girls were now adopting this bleak way of thinking. As the years went by, matters worsened. Lesbian attitudes towards gay men passed from indifference to hostility, and upon any manifestation of effeminacy, they began to pour open contempt. It was regarded not so much as sinful or repulsive as politically ineffectual. One of the surest ways of making yourself and other people notice your masculinity, whether you are in fact a man or not, is to talk incessantly about politics or money. This is what the majority of lesbians had decided to do. Their cause became almost synonymous with women's liberation. The partial merging of these two factions was almost inevitable. Not many liberationists would say that they demanded the right to make love with partners of whatever sex they chose, but many lesbians would certainly state that they wished for a life in which they could enter without question all masculine territory, including that of sharing and possibly shouldering the financial burdens of living with a woman. There is, on the other hand, a species of gay man which finds the practical worries of life intimidating. Such a person likes the society of girls, because he hopes that, with them, conversation will be less worldly, less political, less mercenary. For this reason, there were usually a few women at gatherings arranged by male homosexuals. Their presence made functions look well attended, and their subscriptions swelled party funds. None of the boys seemed threatened by them. If I were asked to describe the difference between the sexes in the gay world, I would say that the men wanted to be amused, the girls sought vindication. In the late 60s, it seemed to me that these meetings were mostly genuinely social. If they were political, they were not stridently so. If secretly they were vast shopping centers, they never exuded that atmosphere, both crude and furtive, which makes frequenting gay public houses such a daunting prospect. Once, while I was in Bristol helping to declare it a gay city, the governor of the event said, "This is Gay Week, and I mean gay. I know that the place is full of gay bars, and that many of you stand in them night after night, but you never speak to anyone. You never seem to be enjoying yourselves." That young man had all my sympathy. From the beginning, the campaign for homosexual equality was as fundamentally political as the word campaign implies, but it also catered for the human needs of its members. Trips along the Thames, musical evenings, even a CHE fair were arranged. Perhaps because my sister was the wife of a country parson, I was quite accustomed to such activities, and I was never contemptuous of their parochial element. I was also aware that, if there had been such an organization when I was young, I would have been its founder member. If there had been in existence any building in London where the very thing that made it impossible for me to feel at ease with other groups of men would have been taken for granted, I would have been on the doorstep before the place was opened. In the early days, whether speaking to men, women, or a mixture of the two, I always assumed that my function was to entertain, but I did occasionally issue warnings. One of these was against forming an exile's view of reality. It was, I thought, likely to be as wide of the mark as Mr. Browning's idea of an English April. Just because full-time homosexuals are on the outside of certain experiences, just because they stand with their cold noses pressed against the window pane, gazing through it at the carpet-slipper setup, they should not suppose that everything by the fireside is permanent, peaceful. The terrible truth is that the people on the inside are trying to get out. At all these events I was indulgently received and very courteously treated. Someone always fetched me, fed me, and transported me back to Beaufort Street when the evening ended. The campaign was poor, and so was I. A fee of about £5 was most acceptable, and these transactions had about them a pleasant amateurishness. Inevitably, as my hold on the reins of my bandwagon tightened, this passed. I am writing of a time when I was both working as a model and giving these small talks. Between them, these two professions earned me a living, but I was aware that I ought to be turning my new situation to better account. I was still not in the arena, not even in a ringside seat. All of my friends tried to help, but no fringe benefits seemed to dangle from the fact of my having written a book. My agent came to the rescue. He was not content with trafficking in the work of others. He also wished to write. Like a nurse ministering to the sick in a plague of words, it was only to be expected that eventually he himself would succumb to the disease. The theme that he chose as the subject of his own book was style, not of writing, but of living. He showed me a list of chapter headings, a plan of campaign, and so on, and asked me what I thought of them. I replied that they displayed masterly powers of organization, but added that, as a way of convincing a publisher that a book was actually in the process of being written, they were a dead loss. I suggested that what was needed was a tin suitcase stuffed to bursting with typescript. My agent agreed and solicited my help. The longer I contemplated the subject he had selected, the more opinions I found I had. I wrote, and I wrote, and I wrote. When the gold, the yellow metal, was sifted from the dross of my discourse, there appeared to be very little that would enrich the publisher to whom it was to be presented. Though I was most handsomely rewarded for my useless assistance, I felt somehow let down. I had the nerve to borrow back the work, for which I had already been paid, and take it to Messrs. Jonathan Cape, whence it was returned as quickly as if we had been playing badminton. I embraced my old friend Defeat, and went on as though nothing unpleasant had happened. My agent fled to Texas. My unloved typescript lay among the fluff under my bed, until I received a visit from an actress who had divorced the stage and married a member of the legendary Wolfe family. As she reclined amidst the dust of my room, she asked wistfully, "Don't you ever write anything that Cecil could publish?" I dived under the bed and brought out my thoughts on style, now a grayish-yellow in color. "If he doesn't want them," I said with a bitter laugh, "throw them away." This statement I later regretted. When I asked for the return of my work, I inadvertently brought into effect Proust's first law. Love does not cause jealousy. It is jealousy that engenders love. The moment it was implied that I had found a use for my typescript, Mr. Wolfe's indifference vanished. He decided to publish a book on style. The recall of my literary effort was not a ruse. I wanted it because I thought it might be of interest to Mr. Mitchell, the famous maker of television documentaries. Looked at from the front, a television screen is a small space in which personalities and events jostle one another for a brief moment of glory, or at least of public attention. Seen from behind, it is an arid waste, in which, like farmers in a dust bowl, broadcasters and producers dig for something, anything, on which to feed their bleating flocks. If somewhere there is a woman who has made the largest patchwork quilt in the world, immediately this is known, documentary interest in her will become keen, nay desperate. "Get her," snarls the director. "She's in the Antarctic," his secretary quietly explains. "Get her," her employer repeats louder than before. The indefatigable needle woman is snatched by helicopters from the ice floes. Her airfare to New York is paid. She is placed in an expensive hotel. The next day, she murmurs a few shy words into a microphone, and is returned to the everlasting snows. Only God and Mr. Bernstein know the cost of such an escapade. When not even this much material is to hand, a program is made about Soho. For this reason, I was not altogether surprised when, walking innocently along Old Compton Street, I was waylaid by an acquaintance with the question, "Do you want to be in a thing about Soho?" "Another?" "Yes, another." I remembered with how little enthusiasm I had occasionally watched these programs. They are invariably mixtures of interviews with bemused Italian caterers, insults from beery bohemians, and the confessions of bored prostitutes. Even so, I nodded. If we wish to be totally free from blame for our anonymity, we must never say no to anything. So much later that I had quite forgotten the few words exchanged in the street. A minor televisionary, whom I had never met, telephoned me to remind me of them. I agreed to meet him at the As You Like It cafe bar in Monmouth Street. This was positively the last of the layabout cafes, those marvelous places where you could sit through lunch and tea and supper without ordering anything more than one cup of coffee. I chose this venue so that, if the appointment was not kept, it would not in any way disturb my way of life. It was an establishment where several times a week, either accompanied or alone, I sat for hours eating lotus petals. As it happened, I was not betrayed. The stranger fed me with tea and questions about the difference between Soho now and what it had been like when I was young. I explained that the district had gone down terribly. You used to be able to get your throat cut on a really big scale, but now the entire region was riddled with nothing better than dim basements, where girls take off their clothes for money. I pointed out that, as a test of the closeness of your relationship with the world, sex could never be a patch on being murdered. That's when someone really does risk his life for you. My inquisitor seemed dazed rather than enlightened by what I said, but he must have regaled his employers with a favorable account of our meeting, because, after another interval of several weeks, he telephoned me again. This time, he wished me to go immediately to a public house in Greek Street. There, half an hour later, I found the televisionary, two members of a pop group called the Strawbs, and Mr. Mitchell, whose genius for television documentaries was explained to me. He wore a suit and seemed slightly ill at ease. To offset this, he was very friendly and bought innumerable drinks for all of us. At that time, I formed no positive opinion of him whatsoever. This, I later learned, is the minimal impression that he aims to create at all times. He was the first to leave the party saying, "We must meet again sometime," which everyone knows is English for goodbye. I was therefore astonished when, within a few days, he visited my room in Chelsea. During the next few weeks, several conversations between us took place either at my home or his, which was temporarily in London. To me, our discussions did not seem particularly purposeful, but they must have been to him, for a day finally came when he said, "I think we'll make it all in this room." "We'll make what?" I asked. "The film." "About Soho?" "It won't be about Soho." "Then what will it be about?" "You." Early in October of 1968, a production team of 6 marched on Beaufort Street. So small is my room that the sound equipment and the 2 men who claimed to understand it were compelled to spend all their working hours in the bathroom. The girl who lived in the back room on my floor couldn't go to the gents for a week. Not only was the routine of the house disrupted, the whole street was disturbed by a generator which chugged away happily outside the front door until the neighbors complained. Sheets of pink acetate were fixed over the windows of my room, and for 4 days, as though lit by the dawn of a new Doris Day, I walked about, sat in my chair, or rolled on my bed, droning on about eternal things. The resulting abundance of material, I am happy to tell you, was rendered down until it lasted only half an hour, and was shown on Granada television at the end of the following year. This program was well received except by the Daily Express, and even that paper savaged me rather than the makers of the film. The public curiosity aroused caused an unknown woman working for Granada to telephone me. "They keep asking who you are," she complained. "Who indeed?" said I. "Apparently there's some book that you've written." I admitted that I was the author of a meager number of books, and mentioned that the latest of these was called The Naked Civil Servant. She seemed content with this information, and I heard no more from her. Evidently, as far as she was concerned, the mystery was solved. For me, it merely deepened. I had no difficulty in understanding why, from the television company's point of view, no mention of the book must be made during the program. Had it been, the entire project might then have seemed to be an advertisement for which the wrong people were being paid. Worse, my ingrained eccentricities might have appeared to be assumed for the purpose of boosting book sales. What I found strange was that, when the papers mentioned the time at which the documentary was being shown, they made no reference to the book. And in no advertisement for the book was anything said to connect me with the film. My bewilderness amounted to downright astonishment when I learned that the publishing house and the television company concerned were as one on this matter. You cannot turn your toes toward Golden Square without being asked of any program you have made? Will it be part of a series? I have no idea whether Mr. Mitchell was asked to make other similar films to mine after it turned out to be a mild success, or whether, before he began, he already thought of it as one of several such features. The final result was that the film about me was shown twice, first by itself, and later as the first of 6 documentaries about old men looking back on their lives. After all these events, I came to know the Mitchells personally. They proposed that another film should be made, this time not about my habits, but my opinions. It was to help with this project that I asked Mr. Wolfe to return my book about style. When this second documentary did not materialize, I was disappointed. It seemed that fate had thrust me back into limbo, or at least not drawn me forward. I did not dream that one day, beautifully made though it was, Mr. Mitchell's film, in terms of publicity, would seem no more than a trailer for the television version of The Naked Civil Servant. I still hold Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell in the highest regard, and we write to each other at Christmas time, but it has become doubtful that we will ever make another television program together. In a small way I now live the showbiz life, which to Mr. Mitchell is like cock-crow to a vampire. The word actor causes him to fling his arms across his eyes and fall back against the nearest wall.